Hey, real quick, this is our last morning together, and I just want to say to you guys that I'm really proud of you. I want to let you know that with all my heart, I believe that you guys are going to change the world. I believe with all my heart that the best is yet to come, and that you're going to make a difference for Jesus. But in order to do that, you have got to learn to put your fears at rest. Because everybody's afraid of something. Okay? I'm going to tell you my number one fear. It's irrational, it's weird, but I'm just going to be honest. Okay? I have a phobia of peacocks. You can laugh, it's okay. Stop it. Literally, if there was a peacock that came in here, I would jet out here and let all of you fight for your own lives. When I was growing up, my babysitters, they lived next to a peacock farm. And we used to go outside and eat our lunch, and the peacocks would chase us around and steal our lunch. And ever since then, if I see a peacock, I'm like, Satan. I hate NBC. Anyway, here's the thing. All of us are afraid of something. I travel a lot for my job, and I'm flying. In the next 3 months, I'm going to like 20 different cities to go help different churches and organizations think through things. And this one particular flight I was on, I had my Bible out, and I was reading it as people were getting on board. And the guy who was sitting next to me sat down, looked at my Bible. He's like, "You're one of those Christians, aren't you?" And I thought to myself, "Oh, this is going to be a fun flight." And I said, well, I'm a Christian. I don't know what those are. Guess you have to be more specific. I might be those, but let's find out. I said, "What do you mean?" He's like, "Oh, you're one of those Christians who just think everything's going to be okay, but right now you're just caught in fear, and you're afraid everything bad is going to happen, and you just think everything's going downhill." And I said, "Yeah, that's exactly right, actually. I do think that one day everything's going to be okay. I do think everything's going to go downhill. I try not to be afraid, but I do think there's a lot to be afraid of." He's like, "There's nothing to be afraid of." And I said, "Let me ask you a question. What's your opinion about people? What do you think about people?" He's like, "Well, I think people are naturally good." He's like, "What do you think?" I said, "I don't. I think people are evil to the core." I said, "Every single person I meet I think is evil, deep down inside." He's like, "See, that's just ridiculous." He's like, "That's why you all are afraid." I said, "Yeah, and you should be too." He's like, "Why is that?" I asked him this question. I said, from 1900 to 1999, I said, "Do you know how many people were murdered in the countries of China and Russia? In that 100-year span from 1900 to 2000 or 1999, do you know how many people were murdered?" I'm not saying accidentally killed. I'm not saying died of old age, okay? But I'm saying how many people were murdered. He's like, "No." I said, in that 100-year period between Russia and China, 120 million people were murdered. 120 million. And then let's throw on all the numbers of millions of people that died in the Holocaust, and all the different wars, and all the different genocides that happened. I said, "How are you not afraid?" I said, "Let's throw on top there all the different serial killers. Well, what about the genocides in all the different countries, like in the continent of Africa, and the brutal dictators that have taken over? What about the fact that over 50 million babies have been aborted? What about that? What about the human trafficking that has gone up? What about sex slavery in many countries where little kids as old as 8 years old, little girls 8 years old, are sold into sex slavery?" I said, "I'm sorry, but I think people, deep down inside, given the right circumstances, fend for themselves first. And given the right circumstances, anyone you meet is capable of doing anything. So yeah, I think people are evil, and I do think there's a reason to be afraid." And he's like, "People are basically good." And I'm like, "Did you hear anything I just said?" He's like, "No, I don't believe that." I said, "Okay, do me a favor. When you go to bed tonight, don't lock your door. Leave it open." He's like, "I wouldn't do that." I said, "Why not? People are good. People are good. When you go to bed tonight, leave your door open. Put your TV out on the front porch. People are good. They're not going to do anything. He's like, well, I wouldn't do that. I said, well, wait a minute. Why do you lock your door at nighttime? Well, I don't want anybody to come in. Why not? I don't want anybody to do anything. Well, I thought you weren't afraid. I thought people were good. You see, one of the reasons why I love Jesus is that his values help me to keep myself in check. Because you'll never realize how great God's grace is until you realize how much you don't deserve it. And how we really are bad to the core. But God has freed us. And while I do think that there is reason to be afraid, I don't think that we should be afraid. Because I think that fear causes us to do horrible, horrible things. I remember I was flying on this one plane one time, going from LA to Oklahoma City, and I'm all the way in the back of the plane by the bathroom. You know, like my back is up against the bathroom. I can't lean back. Everybody else is able to lean back, and the woman next to me is just going, and I'm like, is there somewhere else I can sit? Because I'm like, this woman's going to lose her mind when we take off. And she didn't. And we took off, and everything's going great. We were starting to land. She stands up as we're landing and making our descent and says, ISIS is on the plane. They've got a bomb. And she tries to step over me. And I stood up, and before I continue, you got to understand, in my whole life, I have never laid a hand on a woman until this moment. Okay? I didn't punch her, I didn't slap her, but I grabbed her by the shoulders and forced her down because she wanted to get out in the aisle and open up the exit, the emergency exit in the plane, which she couldn't have done because we were moving so fast, but still, we don't need crazy lady out in the aisle. And so, like, I push her back down, and I try to keep her there, and she's like, we got to get off the plane, we got to get off the plane. I said, no, it's going to be okay. I said, and I'm trying to comfort her, and I'm not very good at comforting people. This is my way of comforting her. She said, we're going to crash. I said, no, you don't worry about it. It's a good way to die. If we do crash, we're 30,000 feet. We're going to, pass out before we hit the ground. You won't even know what happened. It's a good way to go. And that didn't help her feel better. And I'm trying to get her to focus on other things and not to be afraid and everything. And we land, and I'm just like so tired. And I sit down, and she walks past me. And she's like, oh, I've got to get to my other flight. And I'm like, oh, God bless that person. You see, as Yoda says, fear is a path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. You naturally fear whatever it is that makes you feel out of control or that makes you feel like you don't understand it. So if you face a person or if you face a circumstance that makes you feel like you're out of control or that you don't understand, you have two options. You can gravitate and give into fear, or you can give into love. You see, I believe that the difference between fear and love is perspective. I think that the difference between what you think is an obstacle and what God sees as an opportunity is perspective. What you see as stress and what God sees as an opportunity for you to grow, I think is perspective. What you see as temptation, what God sees as a test, is perspective. What you see as fear and what God sees as love is perspective. Now we have this sign right here, Fleoavre. It sounds like something a politician would say if you put those words together. However, here's the deal. Depending on your perspective, you're going to focus on one of two words. In the black of the pillars right here, you have F-E-A-R, which is fear. But on the white panel right here with the black lettering, you have L-O-V-E, which is love. It depends on how you look at it. When you come up to a circumstance that you don't understand, and you come up to a situation or a person that makes you feel out of control, that gives you caution, that makes you kind of go like this, You have two choices. You can either live in fear or you can live in love. But I guarantee you this, if you choose to operate and live your life from the perspective of the fear, you will end up doing horrible things to other people. You will end up doing things to protect yourself. You will end up hurting other people, and really more than anything, you will end up hurting yourself. When I went to Bible college in southern Missouri. Anybody ever been to southern Missouri? Yeah. Don't go. Okay, so I went there. I was there for 11 years. For 4 years. No, not 11. I would have had one tooth and one eye. I was there for 4 years, and I had to get out because you know how most places you go, family trees branch out. But in southern Missouri, it's just a straight line because everybody's related. But that's a whole nother sermon. The first church I ever preached at when I was a freshman in Bible college, first church I ever preached at, had 6 people in it in Hepler, Kansas. The youngest one was 60. They wanted me to start a youth group. It was going to be great, youth group of 40-year-olds. And then the second church I ever preached at, we had 25 people in the church, 50 people in the town. We were the largest church per capita in the entire world. Half of our town was won for Christ. Nobody else would say that. We just needed the other 25 to get in. We would have moved on to the next town. But I preached there for 18 months, and I was able to convince my mom to come to church with me one of these times. And she was fearful to go to church because she's like, they're not going to like me. They're going to treat me differently. They're going to treat me poorly. They're going to be afraid of me. And I got her to come, and the next Sunday, when I showed up to preach, my mom didn't come with me. She came with me the previous Sunday. There were 2 elders waiting for me on the doorstep. And they said, Caleb, we'd like to talk to you. And they took me to the back room, and they said, if you want to keep preaching at this church, don't you ever bring somebody like your mother again. They said, we don't like those people. And I said, well, I don't like you. I said, so I quit. And they said, well, you can't quit. We need you to preach today. And I said, oh, you don't want me to preach after this conversation. Out of all things, you don't want me to preach. You better just have a singspiration or something. I don't know. But you don't want me to preach. No, we need you to preach. And so I went up there, and I took the sermon that I'd written, and I ripped it up, and it was on fasting. Who cares about that? And I got up there, and I preached this sermon on love and grace and letting people know about Jesus. And as I walked out of that church, I said, God, if you ever give me the chance to be a part of a church, I want to be part of a church that is filled with messy, broken people who are struggling with their sexuality, who are cutting, who are in gangs, who are depressed, who have had abortions, who think they're perfect. Because that's what the church is. The church is really a big, beautiful, messy mosaic of broken lives that God has united together to glorify himself. God is the most glorified in our brokenness when we hand our lives over to him and he puts them back together. I do not believe for a second that Jesus Christ came to die on the cross to create a members-only country club filled with fearful, fear-mongering people that have really created a Pharisee factory. If you're not like us, you can't be with us. And so I moved to Southern California, and I got married. I think I've told you this already. My wife is beautiful. Her name is Amy. She's a muy caliente Latina, and in her wildest imagination, she had no clue that her knight in shining armor would look like a cross between Gru, Uncle Fester, and Dr. Evil. You can laugh. This is the eye candy she wakes up to every morning. She is a lucky lady, okay? We moved to Texas, Dallas, Texas for 3.5 years, and while we were there and I was preaching at this church, my parents, separately of one another, moved there to be closer to our family. And then they started attending the church that I was preaching at, even though they knew that I believed that the Bible said something different about sexual intimacy than what they believed. And I didn't know what would happen. But as opposed to my mom's first experience in this small church in Missouri, the people in this church they loved her and they loved my dad, regardless of what they were doing or who they were. Now, we still had our weirdos. Every church has weirdos. You know that. You go to your church, you know who they are. But here's the deal. Let's love each other. Let's all get along. Here's the deal. They felt loved and they felt accepted. And we left 3.5 years later to go to preach in the Southern California area where we live now. And 2 or 3 weeks before we left, my mom and dad both gave their lives to Jesus. And I think to myself, I don't know how that happened. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know. I just didn't. And I asked my mom and dad one time, I said, what was it that did it? And I was expecting maybe some kind of theological or biblical argument or philosophical argument. Here's what they said. That the people in your church treated us like people, not like projects. They treated us like real human beings. And they loved us no matter what. And I think about that. And I think to myself, they chose to live in love rather than to live in fear. You see, the Bible says that you should fear 2 things: God and nothing. That's what the Bible says. You should fear God and you should fear nothing. Listen to what John says here. I'm going to read to you some verses from John chapter 4, beginning in verse 7. This is John's advice. Dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God, and whoever does not love, in other words, fears, does not know God, because God is love. Okay? This is love, verse 10. Not that we loved God, but that he loved us and that he sent his son and as atoning sacrifice for our sins. Verse 11, dear friends, since God so loved us, we ought to love one another. And then he goes on at the end of verse 16. He says again, God is love. Whoever lives in love lives in God and God in them. This is how love is made complete among us, so that we will have confidence on the day of judgment. In this world, we are like Jesus. There is no fear in love. There is no fear in love. Repeat this with me. Say this with me. There is no fear in love. Say it again. There is no fear in love. But perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made in perfect love. You see, if you follow Jesus, you have nothing to fear. Fear will be a constant companion in life. You will always meet people and face situations where you do not understand them, or they make you feel like you're out of control. But that's no excuse. Even though fear is a constant companion, you do not have to give into it. You can live from an aspect of love. And when you live from love, you're just showing that God is a part of your life. When you choose to love somebody rather than to fear them, you're showing that God is a part of their life. When you choose to love somebody instead of get even with them, you're showing that you love God. When you choose to love somebody rather than to be bitter against them, you're showing that God is a part of your life. You have a choice today, and it's all about perspective. In our final session, you're going to hear from a phenomenal speaker named Taylor, a friend of mine. He is a great dude. He is a great communicator, and this is why I can tell you that he's going to challenge you, and he's going to teach you how to live from an aspect of love and not give in to fear, so that when you leave here, you will have no problem being in the light. And you will have absolutely no problem whatsoever just undoing the chains around you. And that you can rip the labels of shame off of you. and that you can live from an aspect of love. And you will never be able to make a difference in this world if you do not love. I guarantee you that if my parents had not felt loved, they would not be following Jesus today. And Jesus says it's up to you. It's up to you. Will you live from love or will you live from fear? You will love the main session later on today. And I want us to be a group of people that leaves here living from a perspective of love.